I'm Paul Johnson, Senior Minister of this congregation, and I'm very pleased to welcome all of you here this evening for this Hiroshima commemoration. This is very poignant for me each year because it brings me back to the year 1984, where I was in Hiroshima for the commemoration, and we met all day with those who survived, and many of them seriously maimed, and then took part in the commemoration ceremonies, and then in the evening launched the lanterns down the river, representing all the souls that were lost. This is an opportunity for all of us, of course, to redouble our personal commitments and efforts for peace. This year, when we think of the Daniel Berrigan and how he committed his whole life to peace. And I was looking today at his celebrated 10 Commandments, and I'm going to ask that you help with some interpretation of this for me. You can talk to me later, but he had 10 wonderful commandments. The last one, though, was start with the impossible, proceed calmly with the improbable, no worry, there were at least 5 exits. What did he mean by the 5 exits? Let me know if you have a thought about that. But now I want to turn things over to Shirley Romaine, who's chair of the Breakneck Sane and Peace Action. Now I call upon Shirley to introduce the rest of the program. Shirley?
Thank you, Reverend Johnson. And just a few thank yous before we begin the program, because we really are grateful to lots of people who put this together. Thank you, Reverend Johnson, and thank you, Claire DeRoche, for your wisdom and smarts and lovely temperament, and for the refreshments we're going to have at the end of the program. So thank you. I want to thank the Unitarian Universalists congregation at Shelter Rock for giving us shelter. You know, we always used to meet for years and years. We met at Grace Avenue Park in Great Neck. And no matter what the date, whenever we arranged it, the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th, the 6th, which is actually the Hiroshima Day, it either rained or it threatened to rain. So really, UUSR has really given us shelter, and we're very grateful for that. I want to thank Hiroko Lee and her friends for the origami cranes. You'll hear more about them later. And a very special thanks to Farah Shandu for the music that she has chosen to do for our program tonight. And we begin with Farah and with Eileen Friedman, who will sing Hashkavenu, a duet, and their accompanist will be Tim Pyarts. And this piece of music was written by the cantor at Temple Bethel of Great Neck.
The
Thank you. Lovely and so appropriate. This is a memorial. Tonight, the meeting is dedicated to the memory of Father Daniel Berrigan, who lived his life in nonviolent resistance to end war, nuclear weapons, and poverty. You saw him reading one of the poems in the film loop that you saw before the program began. The heading, I find this very interesting. Sometimes the best way to really know about a person's character is to read the heading in the obituary of that person. It's almost like poetry because the words, it has to be very short and the words have to be exactly correct. So I'd like to read some of them for Father Berrigan because I think they are so appropriate. They're very telling, really. This is the first. Penniless priest who saw value in activism. Another defiant priest who preached pacifism dies at 94. And another, he traveled light, just a backpack and beliefs. More about him and more poems as the program goes along. Our program tonight marks the 71st anniversary of the beginning of the nuclear age and the deadliest act of war in history, the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and a few days later of Nagasaki. The bomb marked a crucial turning point for the human species. And the volatile world in which we are living 71 years later makes the specter of the bomb more ominous than ever. There are still 16,000 nuclear weapons in 9 countries, and 90% of them are in the United States and in Russia. It is past time for us to change course. Former Secretary of Defense from 1994 to 1947, William Perry, a man who knows more about the science and politics of nuclear weapons than any living person, warns in his new book, My Journey to the Nuclear Brink, that the nuclear danger is growing greater every year, that even a single nuclear detonation could destroy our way of life. He bemoans the fact that the danger of a nuclear catastrophe is greater now than it was during the Cold War, and most people are blissfully unaware of it. His is a compelling and troublesome history of bad politics and bad choices. He wants this memoir to be a wake-up call. I really think he's written it because he feels compelled to share what he knows as both an insider and an outsider person on this nuclear issue. I'm hoping that we can get him to come to UU. I know that he will be speaking in New York in the fall, and I really think it would be very important for us to hear him. In addition to our speakers and more poetry, our call will be for action. This is where we really come in. There are petitions to our local officials, and if you haven't signed one, please don't leave without having signed it. We're going to deliver them personally. And on the backs of your program, you will find addresses for all of our elected members of Congress. Please use them. Margaret Melkonian is our action guru, and she will inspire you to act when she comes up on the agenda. On the positive side, and I think we should try to find some positive things, and we can, we've really had 2 major victories. The nuclear treaty with the United Nations and the US and Iran is a hard-fought reality. And I was looking over my remarks for last year, and last year we were really planning the things that we were going to do to see that this pact was enacted. Well, I believe it was public pressure on our members of Congress that ultimately made it happen. I mean, it was really down to a photo finish, but I really think that had a great deal to do with it. And then when we learned that the president was going to be in Japan, there was great pressure for him to go to Hiroshima. On our part, it may well have moved him to do so. I really don't know that for a fact. But in Hiroshima, he called for a world without nuclear weapons. We must hold him to that. And and it is in this national election, and I bemoan this, that in this election that seems to have gone on forever, there is precious little mention of this great, important issue. I'm sure that's one of the reasons that Secretary Perry has written this book. It's almost as if he feels he's compelled to do it while he still can. And there's a wonderful review of it, if you don't get to the book, a wonderful review of it in the New York Review of Books. Interesting, I read it, and it was signed by Jerry Brown, and I thought, gee, which Jerry Brown is that? And I looked it up, and of course it's Governor Jerry Brown, who's very good on this issue and very aware and cannot say enough about how excellent this book is. And it's not being publicized in a very big way, so it really behooves us to do something about it. I think we really have to address the fact in this election that our candidates are really not dealing with this. There is a lot for us to do, as you will hear later in the program, and we can start tomorrow. So, with that, I want to introduce our next speaker, who is Kate Alexander. She is the new and dynamic Director of Policy and Outreach for Peace Action of New York State. We haven't met except on email, but I am as eager to hear her as I'm sure you are. So here is Kate Alexander. Kate.
So first, I have to thank everyone who put this night together. I'm sure it is more than the names on the flyer, but in particular, of course, to Great Neck Sane and the Long Alliance for Peaceful Alternatives and the Social Justice Committee for inviting me here and for putting on this really exceptional event in an age when most people of my generation are asking, are nuclear weapons still relevant? It is no small thing to have this many people in this room, so I thank you. Second, like Shirley, I want to take a minute to acknowledge the difficulty of the world and the political climate in which we find ourselves. Because especially in the last month or so, it has been so heavy and it has been so difficult. But as is so exemplified in the cause of abolishing nuclear weapons, what we're in is not really a political battle fought with moral language. We are in a battle for our morals, which just happens to be happening in the political field. And just as so many holes were being made by so many activists in the barriers that have kept so many of our privileges invisible and the suffering of the marginalized so far away from our consciousness, we have politicians now who are brazenly working to reinforce those barriers, and millions of Americans who have been choosing ignorance and hate and the security of an unchallenged worldview instead of informed empathy and compassion and love. Tonight we're going to make a few more holes in those barriers that have kept us separated from each other, the barriers which have shielded us from the consequences of our actions and especially the consequences of our militarism. Because the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are easily among the most devastating consequences of our militarism in US history. And yet, somehow, having nuclear weapons in the US is conscionable, it's a given, and proposals to modernize our nuclear weapons arsenal are heralded as essential. And I think that's because we don't really sit with the discomfort of war. We don't sit with this moral discomfort of nuclear war and its damage. We kind of throw around words like catastrophic or cataclysmic. But that's not really how you describe what this is, because it's not the language that's used by the communities who have been affected by these weapons. What this really is, what we're talking about in this room, is unparalleled loss. We hear it in the language of heartbreak and grief and pain and anger that's used by the survivors of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the hibakusha. Kunihiko Bunkohora has shared that my father was blown away by the blast, and his body was pierced by shards of glass and wooden rubble. My father went to a nearby river to wash his body, and when he came back home, the black rain began to fall. Years later, my father was diagnosed with stomach cancer and my mother with breast cancer, and they both passed away. Because I was in Brazil, I was not able to meet with them at the end. Shoso Hirai. Mr. Hirai was exposed to the atomic bomb at his friend's house 4 kilometers from the epicenter while going to a munitions factory as a mobilized student. He entered into the city center the following day to look for his father, who had gone to work, and his younger brother, who was also a mobilized student. He only found his father's bones, and his younger brother is still missing. We must sit with these stories. We have to. It's our moral duty. Because we have to recognize war for what it is and eliminate this language of grand conquest. We have to use a different language. We have to use the language of loss and of grief, because that's the way it is expressed by communities who have actually had to survive what war has done to them and what our nation has done to them, and what we in silence, more afraid in our media of protests and protesters than of maintaining weapons of war and endless war, what we have done to them. We have to break down the barriers that keep us secure in our place in the world and welcome with open arms the informed perspectives about the others, the perspectives that challenge us and demand better. In the same way, allies for racial justice, which we are in the peace movement, we must listen and take leadership from the communities directly affected. You have to listen to the needs of the families of Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Alton Sterling, Philando Castile, Eric Garner, Sandra Bland, Corinne Gaines, and so many more. We have to listen to the cries and protests and anger from the community impacted by our domestic wars if we're ever going to end them. And we must listen to the cries and grief and anger of communities impacted by our foreign wars, by our nuclear weapons, if we are ever going to end them. But first, before we can stand with these communities and for their demands, we have to listen to them. Shigeko Sasumori. Shigeko Sasumori-san was 13 years old when the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. Hearing the sound of a plane, she looked up to see a B-29 flying overhead. Seconds later, she was knocked unconscious by the blast. When she came to, she was so badly burned that she was unrecognizable. Shigeko repeated her name and address over and over until she was finally found by her father. This is heartbreak and grief and loss and anger. And if we recognize this as a loss that is caused by us, I think we would recognize and expect of ourselves better. We would begin to exercise moral leadership for nuclear abolition just because it is the right thing to do. For the same reason that little kids say this isn't fair and throw a fit, nuclear abolition is just simply, unequivocally, and essentially just the right thing to do. And the pundits will tell you that it isn't. But the pundits are military experts. They are not foreign policy experts. They are not long-term peace experts. Their background is in the military. They're military experts. The only experts in nuclear war are those who have lived through it. But I don't see any hibakusha on weapons on any of these talk shows when we're talking about nuclear weapons. And they say, these real experts, they say never again. So nuclear abolition is simply the right thing to do because the only thing you really need to know about war is that it's objectionable, just because you object to it. And nuclear war is not simply objectionable, it is unconscionable. Because one nuclear weapon detonating over a city would instantly burn away 40 to 65 square miles. That is roughly the size of San Francisco and 2 to 3 times the size of Manhattan. 120 to 200,000 people immediately died in the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and hundreds of thousands more died in the following months and years from radiation poisoning. And the typical US nuclear weapon today is 70 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. And we still have over 6,000 of those weapons. But knowing what we did to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and what we did to the Japanese at home, all I can think of is what were we thinking? And maybe most terribly, how close are we to doing this again, but in the Middle East and to our Islamic friends? If some objective, some mission or goal requires that kind of destruction, maybe we need to reevaluate that goal. Because nuclear weapons do not root out terrorism. Nuclear weapons do not discriminate between military and civilians. Nuclear weapons have not prevented conflict between India and Pakistan. Nuclear weapons have not prevented North Korea from weapons tests. Nuclear weapons have not prevented the US from provoking Russia or vice versa. Nuclear weapons only destroy. They destroy our environment, they destroy our economy, they destroy public health, they destroy families. And as the people creating them, they destroy our hearts and mind and our standing in the world. They don't address any of today's threats in international peace and security. They are a threat in international peace and security. And keeping them and maintaining them wastes our resources. And yet, the current administration is proposing spending $1 trillion over 30 years on nuclear weapons. $1 trillion, or $348 billion in 10 years, if that number is more imaginable, on a weapon system that we're never supposed to use. For that same amount of money, for 10 years, we could provide 39 million homes with renewable energy, or give 11 million students 4-year scholarships to a public university, again, for 10 years. We could support about 3.5 million veterans receiving VA medical care. We could give about 10 million low-income persons health care for 10 years. We could get over 4 million children enrolled in the Head Start program, or pay the salaries of almost 500,000 elementary school teachers for 10 years. Education, healthcare, veterans medical care, renewable energy, or nuclear weapons. It's pretty clear to me where we should be spending our money. It's on programs we need, not on weapons we should never use. But instead of thinking about what we could spend with that money, think for a minute about what we will lose because we have to find that money somewhere else. Education, healthcare, veterans medical care, renewable energy, these are the programs that lose funding because we fund endless war endlessly. For students here, and for those of you with children, and for the students whose peace activism we foster at Peace Action New York State, and for me as a young person in this country, the question is really simple. How can we afford this without bankrupting my future? But there's more at stake here than money, even though these are the investments that are going to shape our future. What we're trading in for nuclear weapons is our moral standing. Because how can we listen to Shigeko's story and remind ourselves that she was so badly burned she could not move, and then tell her we are building more nuclear weapons? How can we listen to Shoso Hirai, whose brother is still missing, and tell him we need these weapons because we might have to use them again? How can we listen to Kunihiko Bunkohora, who lost both his parents, and tell him these weapons will protect us and we need thousands of them? President Obama made history this year when he became the first sitting US president to visit Hiroshima. There, he said, "Why do we come to this place, to Hiroshima? We come to ponder a terrible force unleashed in a not-so-distant past. We come to mourn the dead, including over 100,000 in Japanese men, women, and children, thousands of Koreans, a dozen Americans held prisoner. Their souls speak to us. They ask us to look inward, to take stock of who we are and what we might become." Well, I couldn't agree more, Mr. President. So when our pundits and our administration tell us that nuclear weapons are necessary for security, We must shout back, you may be experts in military strategy, but you are not experts in nuclear war. The Hibakusha are experts in nuclear war. They know the cost of nuclear weapons, and our children will know the cost of nuclear weapons when you defund their future. And I have listened to them, and I have grieved for them, and I have learned from them, and today we stand for them in saying we must rid the world of nuclear weapons. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. It is now my pleasure to introduce Emily Beck. She is a junior at Hofstra University, and she is one of the Peace Fellows, a very impressive program that is funded at Hofstra, that is funded by the Long Island Alliance for Peaceful Alternatives, and is really producing some very important young people who I think will have a real role to play in our future. So Emily is going to do another of Father Berrigan's poems, and then she has a story to tell you. So it is my pleasure to introduce Emily Beck.
Hello. I would just like to start by thanking everyone who made this night possible and all of you for coming. It's so wonderful to see all of you. Like it was said, I'm going into my third year at Hofstra, and she had mentioned the Peace Fellowship, which Margaret, who's going to be doing the call to action, orchestrates. And so with that program, about 20 of us would get together weekly, students and professors, and we would discuss issues of war and peace, both historical and present. So nuclear weapons are a huge topic that we touched upon in almost every session because it relates to just about everything that we talk about. So this program, it really taught me a lot, and it sort of forced me to recognize certain realities that are easy to ignore because we might not always see them. And it will undoubtedly affect the work that I'll do in the future. So thank you to the Long Island Alliance and also to Kate Alexander, who is the student, she organizes student chapters with Peace Action New York State. So we're working together now to start one at Hofstra, which I'm really excited about. So that'll be starting in the fall. And one of the main topics that we'll be discussing and organizing around is stopping endless wars and the abolition of nuclear weapons. So Kate and I actually met at a dinner organized for peace activists, and at that dinner, I received a bunch of peace cranes that we're all wearing tonight. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the cranes. And on campus, we actually have used them at an art show. So I'm involved in an art club. And that club, along with Hofstra's Amnesty International chapter, every semester we put on an art show that's on social justice issues. It's called 100% Human. So what we did with the cranes was we strung them, and then we hung them all around all of the art exhibits. So it was really nice, and there was a little educational piece about the cranes and their significance. As I'm sure all of you know, they are recognized internationally as a symbol of peace ever since the world has been introduced to Sadako Sasaki's story, which is what I'm going to be talking about tonight. So Sadako was a Japanese girl living in Hiroshima when the United States dropped the atom bomb. She was 2, and 10 years later, she was diagnosed with leukemia as a result of exposure to the radiation. And according to ancient Japanese legend, a person who folds 1,000 paper cranes will get a wish granted by the gods. So she began folding, and unfortunately, she was only able to fold 644 before she passed away. But then her classmates sort of took up her legacy and started folding as well. And now there are memorials dedicated to her featuring the cranes all over the world, including a large one in Hiroshima. So students at Hofstra have taken on this mission to fold cranes, and we will continue to do that and continue to use the cranes to make peace visible on campus and show why a situation like the atrocities that happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki can never happen again. So to finish, I'll just read a poem written by Father Dan Berrigan. And though I didn't know him and I didn't have the pleasure of working with him, I am fortunate enough to work with people who do. And in that way, his work and his contributions to peace and to this sort of business that we're in has really enabled me to do all that I can do. So this poem is called Children in the Shelter. Imagine 3 of them, as though survival were a rat's word and a rat's death waited there at the end. And I must have, in the century's boneyard, heft of flesh and bone in my arms. I picked up the littlest a boy, his face breaded with rice, his sister calmly feeding him as we climbed down. In my arms fathered in a moment's grace, the Messiah of all my tears, I bore, reborn, a Hiroshima child from hell. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Sister Jean Clark, where are you? You're up next. Let me just say that Jean has spoken to us so movingly about peace and the environment and social justice. And she's here with another of Daniel Berrigan's poems. And she's going to share a personal memoir of her experience with Father Daniel Berrigan. It's my pleasure to introduce Sister Jean Clark.
Well, Dan Berrigan changed my life. And in order to read his poem, I would just like to put it in context. In 1980, I went to Ground Zero, Center for Nonviolent Action, in the state of Washington, the home of the Trident submarine. And for those who may not know the Trident, I would just like to describe it. One Trident is 2 football fields long, and on it are 25 missiles, and on each one of those 25 missiles are 14 to 17 individually targeted warheads, atom bombs. 25 missiles, on each missile, 14 to 17 Hiroshimas. One Trident submarine can destroy 409 cities at once. And when I went to Ground Zero before the first Trident submarine was deployed, the Navy was planning to build 30 of them. It's hard for us to take that in, that amount of violence. And that's why I went to Ground Zero. And at Ground Zero, we went in front of the Trident submarine when it first came in little rowboats, in order to say no, not in my name. And we went in front of the train that carried the weapons to the Trident submarine and knelt on the tracks as the white train came to say no, not in my name. And that's the poem that Dan wrote. But before I read it, I'd just like to tell you what I wrote about Dan when I was writing for the Ground Zero newspaper in 1980s. And I titled the article, "The Word Made Flesh." Gandhi's secretary, Madhavi Desai, once said about him, "What Gandhi thinks, what he feels, what he says, and what he does are all the same." Gandhi not only searched for the truth, he lived it. And in that sense, he became the truth. I live with this hope that we will become who we are meant to be, that we will reconcile the parts and become one and whole. I live with the hope that we can reconcile our minds and hearts, our words and actions, what we do personally with what we do politically, and that in so doing, that which is now divided will become one. I live with the hope that it is possible to live in right relationships with ourselves, with the earth, with one another, and with God. I'm very grateful for the people in my life who have spoken such words to me, and one of these people is Daniel Berrigan, a priest and poet. And in his play, The Trial of the Catonsville Nine, Dan tells the story of the trial of himself and 8 others who burned draft records during the Vietnam War. As I remember the play, Dan is asked by the prosecutor, "Father Berrigan, did you or did you not burn those draft records?" And the answer is recorded. Yes, I burned paper and not children. And the Word was made flesh. Dan made Vietnam real for me in those words. His action was shocking and disturbing, but for me, he made the Word flesh. He did this by acting on the Word of God as he understood it. Thou shalt not kill. Dan had preached that word as a priest, and now he acted on it and spoke that word in a public place, not unlike a church, the courtroom, to be heard by judge and jury. He wrote his word down in a play, and I heard the word. It touched me, and I have never been the same. One day at Ground Zero, after the white train had come and we had knelt in front of it in order to stop it, later on I opened my mail, and in it was this beautiful piece of paper from Dan. Just typed on this little parchment, and at the bottom, the little heart with the name Daniel. And this was the poem. Wondrously, the unknown coincides with the known. When on the way, knowing is renounced. The nun knelt down before the ghost train, snaking its cargo breathlessly, noiselessly, like a hellish midair mutant through the night. Would death stop short, halt in its tracks? No way of knowing. Unknowing, undesirous of knowing, she knows only, and in parentheses he has, a preview of beatific dawn. Who goes there? Would death stop short, halt in its tracks? We're still working on that. We're still praying and acting and being, trying to be the truth, each of us. Just like Emily just spoke. So Dan's word was passed on to me, passed on to Emily, and all of us, our words, all of our actions are passed on from one to the other, and we become a community of truth. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to share that.
Thank you, Jean. And now I think it's time for us to hear some more music. And we do have Willow, women's wonderful a cappella choir, under the directorship of Farah Shandu. Thank you, Willow. A good, what can I say, a good beginning for our next speaker, who is going to talk to you about action. It's Margaret Melkonian. She is the Executive Director of the Long Island Alliance for Peaceful Alternatives, and really one of the great peacemakers on Long Island. her talk, or I can say her theme, is going to be something that Father Berrigan wrote about. He said, "Know where you stand and stand there." And I think that's what Margaret is going to ask you to do. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Margaret Milconian.
Hi, good evening. Good evening. I learned that from a couple of people. Thank you, Willow, for putting into words the charge that we have and the challenge we have tonight. Because sadly, we gather once again on the 71st anniversary of the U.S. atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We gather to mourn all the victims of weapons testing, use, and production. To mourn the 2,000 killed in those two Japanese cities in 1945. To mourn the downwinders and the uranium miners in the southwest United States. To mourn the Marshall Islanders. To mourn the soldiers ordered to clean up sites after accidents or testing. To mourn all the victims of the theft of billions of dollars spent on war, violence, and destruction. Instead of spending that money, as Martin Luther King told us, on programs of social uplift and human security. We gather tonight to honor the resistance and the witness of the Japanese survivors, the Hibakusha, who spoke to us through Kate tonight, who have been relentless in their pursuit of nuclear abolition for so many years. So tonight we stand with them. We gather to remember the courage and the persistence of Father Berrigan and the Nuclear Plowshares activists, many who have come to visit us here on Long Island. We honor them and remember them for their nonviolent actions to create a world without nuclear weapons, a world without war, and a world without poverty. Father Dan called us to action. Know where you stand and stand there. So I ask you to stand up tonight. So tonight's Let's Take a Stand. And let's stand there for as long as it takes. Let us stand for a world without nuclear weapons. Let us stand for a world without war. Let us stand for a world where all people live together in peace and dignity. You can sit now, but we're going to have to stand for a really long time. I know that we've circulated petitions in this room and outside, so make sure that you sign them. To tell the President and Congress to negotiate once and for all a treaty to abolish nuclear weapons, weapons that can never be used again. To take nuclear weapons off hair trigger alert. To pledge the United States to no first use of nuclear weapons, and to stop the funding of the $1 trillion to modernize the U.S. nuclear arsenals. Take a petition, there's extra copies, get more signatures, send them to your congressmen or your senators. And on the back of the programs, you'll find numbers for Senators Gillibrand and Schumer, and for Long Island Representatives Zeldin, King, Israel, and Rice. Make your voices for nuclear abolition heard. If you don't make a call, they can't hear you. The numbers and the message is on the back of the program. And make sure that you attend and do some bird dogging at candidate meetings here on Long Island and in New York, where we ask a question about the candidates, our congresspeople, do they support nuclear abolition? Are they willing to cut $1 trillion and billions of dollars for U.S. nuclear arsenals? You can ask those questions. The candidates should have an answer. And I ask you also, just a little commercial, to join us on September 26th at Hofstra. Once again, the presidential debate will be held at Hofstra on September 26th. So we plan, and the planning is in the early stages because we just found out about this, to hold a demonstration and a peace vigil on Hempstead Turnpike and Uniondale Avenue on the corner from 4 to 6 to create a peace zone and to call for an end to war, because there is no military solution for conflicts in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and Libya. And we ask you to join us calling for nuclear abolition. And that's the call to action. So there's a lot to do tomorrow, tonight, and in the days ahead. One more final musical selection from Willow and Farah with Alleluia by Randall Thompson. I want to thank Willow again for the uplifting music and the healingness of bringing those sounds into this room. I want to thank Reverend Johnson and all of our speakers tonight. Please join me in that. I want to thank the congregation here at Shelter Rock, and I know we've thanked Claire, but we have to thank her again. And also to Jen and Linda and Sharon and the others in the office and the AV crew here at Shelter Rock. So thank them. And thank you to Sirocco and the others who made the cranes and the story that went behind it that was told so beautifully by Emily. Thank you all for being here and for your stand and your action for peace. Thank you for coming and being part of this, because it's only in the shelter of each other that people can live, and here we are together tonight. So please join us for a little while longer for refreshments and community in the gallery. Thank you. And thank you again, Willow.